So picture the man who wrote the 1812 Overture. I mean, a man who literally wrote explosive, literal cannon fire right into his sheet music.
Right. It's one of the most bombastic things you can hear.
Exactly. And, when you hear those sweeping, majestic melodies of Swan Lake or the Nutcracker,
Yeah.
you probably picture this triumphant, arrogant genius, like a man who just basked in the adoration of the world.
Yeah, that's definitely the cultural image we carry of him today. This architect of grand, glittering musical monuments.
But the reality, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky actually couldn't stand to listen to some of his own greatest hits.
Oh, he resented them deeply.
Right. And he was a man who was originally trained to be basically a mid-level government paper pusher. He was plagued by crippling self-doubt, and he spent his entire life harboring this desperate, heavily censored secret.
Which is wild when you look at the historical and biographical sources we've gathered for this deep dive, because his day-to-day existence was just defined by profound inner turmoil.
It really was.
You know, the music we consider the absolute pinnacle of 19th century elegance, it was actually forged in this constant, agonizing struggle for identity.
And that is exactly our mission for today.
Yeah.
We are going to peel back that elegant fairy tale veneer.
Unpack the real history.
Right. We're exploring the deeply human story beneath the music, trying to bridge the gap between those glittering, world-famous melodies and his intensely private suffering.
Because it's quite a gap.
It is. I mean, learning the truth about Tchaikovsky is kind of like discovering that the person who writes the world's most epic, sweeping love songs is actually, completely heartbroken and utterly trapped.
And to understand how he became so trapped, we really have to look at the landscape he was born into. Because, well, this was 19th century Russia, and the concept of a quote-unquote professional composer simply did not exist.
Wait, really? Not at all?
Not at all. There was no established pathway for musical genius. It wasn't considered a respectable career.
Wow. Okay, so he was born in 1840, right? In a small town called Votkinsk, near the Kama River. And his parents actually did recognize his talent early on.
Oh, yeah. They bought him an orchestra in.
Right, which, for those who don't know, is this massive mechanical barrel organ. It's designed to imitate the elaborate effects of a full orchestra. I mean, it's a wildly complex machine for a child to be playing with.
But he didn't just play with it, He absorbed it. He was incredibly precocious. By age 6, he was already fluent in French and German.
Just a sponge.
Exactly. And he formed this deep, almost fragile attachment to his French governess, Fanny Durbach. He was so sensitive to music that he would literally break down in tears if he was pulled away from the piano.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he'd complain that the music was stuck in his head and wouldn't let him sleep.
Which honestly makes his parents' next move seem completely insane to me. Because at age 10, seeing this obvious prodigy-level talent, they ship him 800 miles away from his family.
Straight to a preparatory school.
Right. For the Imperial School of Jurisprudence. I mean, they are training this hypersensitive musical genius to become a civil servant. I struggle to wrap my head around this.
It's definitely jarring.
Why would you buy your kid a mechanical orchestra, watch them obsess over it, and then basically banish them to study bureaucratic law? That's like buying your kid a grand piano and then forcing them to become a mid-level accountant.
Well, it looks incredibly cruel through a modern lens, but you have to consider the social economics of 1850s Russia. Like I mentioned, there was no public music education system yet.
So there's nowhere to send him anyway.
Exactly. Unless you were born into immense aristocratic wealth, the only musical careers available were teaching in a small academy or playing in a theater orchestra.
Which didn't pay well, I assume.
Not at all. Musicians were essentially viewed as laborers. They sat at the very lowest rank of the social ladder. They basically had no more rights than peasants, and his father's income was unstable, so they needed Pyotr to be financially independent.
Ah, okay. So it was pure survival.
Exactly that. But the cost of that survival was devastating for him. That early separation from his mother scarred him deeply. And then tragedy struck.
Right.
When Tchaikovsky was just 14 years old, his mother died of cholera. And cholera in the 19th century was a horrific, violent way to die. Witnessing this just shattered him.
Yeah, the sources mentioned that this specific loss was what pushed him to write his very first serious composition. It was a waltz written entirely in her memory.
Just channeling all that grief.
Yeah, he took that unbearable grief and poured it directly into the piano. But the rigid path his parents set him on, it didn't bend at all. He was sent right back to school.
The machinery kept moving.
Exactly. He did what he was told, graduating at 19 as a titular counselor, which is essentially just a junior clerk. and went straight to work in the Ministry of Justice.
So for 3 years, the man who would eventually write the world's most famous ballets just sat at a desk stamping documents and drafting legal reports.
It's almost tragic to picture, but you can't keep a mind like that confined to a clerical desk forever. A massive cultural shift was happening in Russia, and it finally offered him an escape route.
But taking that route meant walking straight onto a battlefield.
Right, because stepping into the professional musical world meant picking a side.
Yes. So in 1859, the Russian Musical Society was founded, and that paved the way for the St. Petersburg Conservatory to open in 1862. Tchaikovsky immediately abandoned his bureaucratic career and joined their premier class.
Finally getting formal training.
Exactly. And his primary teacher for instrumentation and composition was a man named Anton Rubinstein.
And Rubinstein's approach is kind of the crux of the problem here, isn't it?
It really is. Rubinstein is teaching Tchaikovsky using very Western, highly Germanic, strict formal rules.
Which, I mean, is a great way to learn the mechanics of an orchestra.
Sure. But outside the conservatory, a completely different, fiercely rebellious musical movement was gaining power. A collective of highly nationalistic Russian composers emerged. They were known as the Mighty Handful, or the Five.
Right, led by figures like Balakirev and Mussorgsky.
Exactly. And they despised the Western conservatories. They viewed German musical rules as imperialist and entirely stifling to the true Russian spirit. They wanted to build a new kind of music, utilizing pure Russian folk roots, whole tone scales, and non-Western harmonic devices.
Okay, let's break that down for a second, because the musical jargon gets a little heavy here. What does a whole tone scale or a non-Western device actually sound like to you or me?
Okay, think of traditional Western music as a perfectly paved highway. The scales they use are designed to create forward momentum. They're always leading you to a predictable, satisfying destination or resolution.
Okay, that makes sense.
But a whole tone scale, which is deeply rooted in Russian folk traditions, doesn't have those natural resting points. It sounds dreamlike, floating, almost unmoored. It doesn't push you to a neat conclusion.
Ah, I see. So he's caught between two completely incompatible worlds. It's like he's trying to build a rustic, asymmetrical wooden log cabin, but his foreman will only let him use the rigid blueprints for a perfectly symmetrical Parisian cathedral.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The raw materials and the required design are actively fighting each other.
And both sides were furious with him for trying to mix them. Rubinstein outright rejected Tchaikovsky's First Symphony. He refused to perform it unless substantial changes were made. He treated a fully grown Tchaikovsky like an incompetent student.
Wow, and what about the nationalists?
Meanwhile, the Five were deeply suspicious of his formal training, even though they occasionally supported pieces like his Romeo and Juliet fantasy overture.
So nobody is happy.
Right. What's fascinating here is how this musical tug-of-war mirrored a massive identity crisis in Russian culture dating all the way back to Peter the Great. The Russian intelligentsia was deeply torn. Do we embrace our native, unpolished traditions? Or do we adopt polished European sophistication?
And Tchaikovsky's entire career became an attempt to solve that national identity crisis.
He was the guy stuck in the middle.
He had to wear this Western mask over his Russian soul just to survive in the conservatory. But, that professional tightrope he was walking, it was nothing compared to the mask he was forced to wear in his private life.
Yeah, the personal side of this story is incredibly heavy.
Right, because while he is navigating this public cultural battlefield, his personal life is an infinitely more dangerous situation.
The historical documents reveal a man living in perpetual fear of exposure. Looking at the recovered, uncensored letters, specifically those written to his brother Modest Tchaikovsky, openly documented his same-sex attractions.
The sources are very clear on this.
Yes. We also see this deeply reflected in his later work, like the emotionally devastating Sixth Symphony. He dedicated that to his 21-year-old nephew, Vladimir Bob Davidov, someone scholars note he had a profound romantic attachment to.
And we really have to acknowledge that for decades, this reality was aggressively erased. Soviet-era officials actively scrubbed references to his sexuality from his correspondence.
They literally censored his letters.
Yeah. And even recently, modern Russian officials, like former culture minister Vladimir Medinsky, have denied it entirely. But impartially looking at the history here, the primary sources, his own handwritten words, they're undeniable.
They are. But in 19th century Tsarist Russia, being discovered meant utter social and professional ruin.
It was incredibly dangerous.
The societal pressure to hide was just crushing, and it pushed him into a disastrous panic move at age 37. To create a shield of societal normalcy, he married a former student of his, Antonina Miliukova.
A marriage that, from what the sources say, imploded almost immediately.
It was a catastrophic mismatch, both psychologically and sexually. The union lasted a mere 2.5 months.
That is incredibly brief.
And the experience was so traumatic for Tchaikovsky that he suffered a complete psychological breakdown. He fled the marriage entirely, suffering from severe writer's block. He reportedly even waded into the freezing Moscow River in a half-hearted attempt to catch pneumonia.
Just to escape the situation.
Exactly. He never publicly blamed Antonina, but the absolute disaster of the marriage forced him to accept that he could never live the conventional life society demanded of him.
But out of that terrifying rock bottom comes one of the most fascinating lifelines in history. Because just before the marriage collapsed, he had started exchanging letters with a woman named Nadezhda von Meck.
Yes, she was a phenomenally wealthy widow of a railway magnate, and she essentially steps in and rescues him.
She became his patroness, right? Providing him with this massive annual allowance for the next 13 years.
It was so much money that he was able to quit his teaching jobs and focus exclusively on composing. She became his closest confidant and his emotional anchor.
But there was a catch.
There was one strict condition to their arrangement. They agreed to never physically meet.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He has this disastrous marriage that lasts mere weeks, but sustains a 13-year, deeply intimate relationship with a woman he literally never shares a room with.
Communicating entirely through thousands of letters.
It's the ultimate 19th century long-distance relationship. And looking at his psychology, you can see exactly why this worked so perfectly for him.
Oh, absolutely. It provided absolute emotional security with zero physical risk. I mean, think about it. Did the absolute safety of this invisible relationship give him the emotional security required to pour his otherwise censored feelings into his music?
It has to have. Physical proximity and societal expectations had just caused a massive breakdown in his marriage.
Right. With von Meck, he didn't have to perform the role of a traditional husband. He didn't have to hide his true self in the shadows. She gave him a protective bubble, an unconditional support system from a safe distance.
And, armed with her financial backing, he didn't have to worry about a day job. He basically became the first full-time professional Russian composer.
He had total freedom to compose whatever he wanted.
Which leads us to the wild irony of the 1812 Overture. Because this piece is a global phenomenon. It's played at massive celebrations. It has real cannons firing. It is the definition of a crowd pleaser. And Tchaikovsky completely resented it.
He wrote it in just 6 weeks. It was a commission for an exhibition in Moscow to commemorate the completion of a cathedral and the 25th anniversary of Emperor Alexander II's coronation.
So it was just a gig to him?
Basically. He actually wrote a letter to von Meck complaining that the piece would be very loud and noisy, but that he composed it with no warm feeling of love. He even warned the conductor that it likely possessed no artistic merits.
He literally thought he was just churning out a noisy commercial gimmick. But the public went absolutely wild for it.
They loved it.
And this massive success, built on a piece he hated, really brings us to the core mechanism of how his music actually worked. Because he was solving that architectural problem we talked about earlier.
Right, trying to build a Russian cabin with French blueprints.
Exactly. So how did he actually do it?
Well, to understand his genius, we have to look at how he manipulated musical structure. In Western music, the golden rule was sonata form. In sonata form, a melody is introduced and then it evolves. It modulates smoothly, meaning it transitions seamlessly from one musical key to another.
Like a plant organically growing new branches and leaves.
Exactly. But as we established, Russian folk melodies don't organically grow. They are static. They sit in one place, beautiful but unchanging.
So if your core melody doesn't naturally evolve, how do you stretch it into a massive 45-minute symphony without the audience just falling asleep?
You sidestep traditional sonata form entirely. Instead, you abandon organic growth and use blocks of dissimilar tonalities.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
Imagine you are walking through a house. In Western music, a hallway gently guides you from a brightly lit living room into a sunlit kitchen. It makes sense. Tchaikovsky, instead, drops you through a trapdoor from that bright living room straight into a pitch-black basement.
Oh, wow.
The clash of musical keys is jarring, sudden, and deeply emotional. And to build momentum, instead of evolving the melody, he uses accumulation.
Accumulation.
Yeah.
So he takes that static Russian melody and just repeats it, but every time it loops, he subtly changes the rhythm or he adds a heavier layer of instruments.
Yes. The sources describe his orchestration as having this sensual opulence. He keeps piling on the sound thicker and thicker.
Building the momentum through sheer repetition.
Right, until it reaches an almost unbearable intensity. It's a pressure cooker. He tightly controls that accumulating tension, holding it right up to the breaking point before finally allowing a massive, violent release.
Wait, the accumulating tension, the immense pressure, the violent release, that's not just a clever musical trick to solve a structural problem.
No, it's not.
That is his life. That is the exact sonic embodiment of a man who is forced to suppress his true identity, letting the internal pressure build and build behind a polite societal mask until he feels like he is going to explode.
The structure of the music perfectly mirrors his psychological reality. But, the conservative critics of the 19th century completely despised it.
Really? Even with the public loving it?
Oh, they hated it. The Austrian critic, Edward Hanslick, listened to Tchaikovsky's violin concerto and infamously declared it a piece of music whose stink one can hear.
Oh my God. It's hard to imagine a more visceral insult for a piece of music.
It's brutal. And another prominent critic, William Foster Apthorpe, reviewed Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony and compared it to a horde of demons struggling in a torrent of brandy.
Wow.
They thought the music was hysterical, formless, and just entirely deficient.
But why the vitriol? Were the critics just threatened because the music didn't follow the rules and was too accessible? It feels like modern movie critics trashing a massive summer blockbuster just because the audience actually enjoyed themselves.
That's a great comparison, and yes, they were terrified of it. In the 19th century, conservative critics viewed classical music as an act of polite, formal discernment. It was supposed to be civilized amusement for high society.
And Tchaikovsky was definitely not polite.
Not at all. His music bypassed the intellect and went straight for the nervous system. It was raw, unfiltered emotionalism. It demanded an active, visceral reaction. To a critic who values polite restraint, that level of violent emotional honesty is deeply threatening.
But the public didn't care about polite restraint. They felt the honesty in it. Audiences adored him, and ultimately, it was that unapologetic emotional intensity that secured his legacy.
Absolutely.
He historically achieved something monumental by combining his rigid conservatory training with the static, raw power of Russian melody. He became the sole bridge between 19th century Russian Romanticism and the explosive 20th century modernism that would soon follow.
Right, composers like Igor Stravinsky.
Exactly. He forced the entire world to listen to the Russian soul.
Yet, despite cementing his place in history, his own life ended abruptly, shrouded in a mystery that scholars still debate today. In 1893, at the age of 53, he died in St. Petersburg.
And the official cause of death was cholera. Right. Contracted from drinking a glass of unboiled water at a local restaurant, which is a deeply eerie, almost cyclical echo of how his mother died.
It is eerie, but almost immediately after his death. And gaining significant traction in academic circles starting in the 1980s, rampant speculation emerged that this was not an accidental infection.
The suicide theories.
Yes. Theories circulated that he took his own life. Some claim he intentionally drank the infected water, while others point to rumors of a court of honor.
A court of honor.
Yeah, a secret tribunal of his former law school peers who allegedly demanded he poison himself to prevent a scandal regarding his sexuality from going public.
But looking at the sources we have, there is no definitive proof either way. The New Grove Dictionary of Music, which is basically the definitive encyclopedia for musicology, flat out states that the evidence is at an impasse.
The accounts are just too messy.
Right. There's confusion among eyewitnesses, contradictory accounts from doctors, and layers of historical obfuscation. The truth is, we simply may never know for sure how he died.
The end of his life remains a closed book. But what he left behind is entirely open. The musicologist Hermann Kretschmar observed something profound about Tchaikovsky's work. He noted that the music possesses the unmistakable mark of truly lived and felt experience.
It wasn't just theory to him.
No. Tchaikovsky wasn't just arranging abstract sounds to please an audience. He was scoring his own life.
And that leads us to a fascinating concept mentioned in the texts, one that completely reframes how we listen to his work today. The idea that Tchaikovsky's music acts as a psychological mirror.
I love that phrase.
It's so accurate. Because he bypassed those polite, formal rules of Western music and instead hammered away at those raw, repeating blocks of immense tension and release, he didn't just express his own pain. He created an acoustic space for listeners to confront their own intense, private feelings.
A safe space for the audience's own emotions.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with this thought to mull over. The next time you sit in a concert hall or put on headphones and you hear a Tchaikovsky melody soaring through a film score or a ballet, pay attention to the tension building inside you.
Listen to what it brings up.
What hidden, unspeakable parts of your own life are you unknowingly projecting into his music? Because when those cannons fire and the orchestra swells to that unbearable, beautiful breaking point, it's not just his secret history you are hearing. It's yours.